Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
You've noticed I'm not Bill. We got a trend going here, 2 weeks in a row, right? I have figured it out. Our brother Bill, as you know, is a very smart and capable man. And yet he knows that even if you eat filet mignon every day, you'd eventually think, this isn't really that good, I'm tired of it. So he has a strategy. Occasionally he'll let some of the rest of us talk, and when he comes back, you think, what a relief. See, he's a smart guy. He's on it. My name's Randy. I'm one of the elders here and a teaching pastor, and it's a joy to get to be with you. It really is something I like to do. And I have some good news. Last night I was going along in this speech that got pretty long, and I got to page 3, and guess what? There was no page 3. That sort of derailed me, and we wandered from there. But I want you to know, as we start today, here is page 3. We're good to go. All right, we're going to start our study today at an Old Testament text. I love the Old Testament. It's a fascinating story of a lot of very interesting things. And it has at the core of it God's continuing plan from the very beginning to create a paradise and make it really a good place to be, put some people a lot like himself there, which would be you and me, and be able to talk to them every day in a direct relationship forever. It's a good strategy. That was God's plan. That was the desire of His heart. Satan, however, existed at the same time. He came along, and we know that story. He caused it to fail. And what I think we see in the Old Testament, and it's a fascinating process, is the way God was not discouraged. He didn't give up. He just began to re-engineer a new plan, which had been the plan all along, that would lead through human events to the life of Jesus Christ. So as we sit here in this day, we have the same opportunity that Adam and Eve did through Jesus to live with God in perfection for eternity. And that's the good news. So we're done with our lesson today, and you can all go home. However, to get there, we have to go through our lifetimes, right? And we have to deal with all the things that we have to deal with. And that's why we have the church. That's why we have fellowship. That's why we have teaching from God. And that's why, hopefully, you're here today. But this story of the Old Testament is much about human affairs, how God interacted with them, what He did, how humans responded, but always under the guidership of God to get to Jesus coming. And then the rest of the story we're living in now till we get to the very end. So, a part of that story was King David. King David was a young man who had a fascinating life as well. As a young man, he killed a giant when no one else in Israel was willing to face him. And all the magic things, not magic, but amazing things we know about King David. It's an interesting story. But King David had to wait a long time to get that. God said, you'll be king. And then many, many years passed, years of conflict and stress and difficulty, where David developed the man that he was. As a part of that comes the text that we're going to start our lesson with. Finally, the time has come in Israel for King David to get to take over the process and begin his official kingship. And it's going through political processes like human affairs always seem to do. And what's finally happening is a group of men are beginning to gather to David, 12 different groups of men from 12 different tribes, and there's a list of that in the Old Testament saying how they were coming and who they were and what they did. But one particular group has a phrase attached to theirs that no one else does of this group of 12. 1 Chronicles 12, verse 23. These are the numbers of the men armed for battle who came to David at Hebron to turn Saul's kingdom over to him as the Lord had said. And it lists all these men, and it gets to verse 32. From Issachar, which was one of the tribes, men who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. Men who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. 200 chiefs with all their relatives under their command. And then the text goes on to the other groups. Men who understood the times and knew what they should do. We're going to spend a little time thinking about that phrase this morning because hopefully you want to be like those men. You want to be able to understand the times, but more importantly, you want to know what you should do. And that's where we are. What were their times? Their times were actually pretty tumultuous. They were the people who lived in the northern kingdom of Israel, where the 10 major tribes had lived. They had been led by King Saul for 40 years. Just in recent years, King Saul and his 3 oldest sons, who were major men, significant leaders in the army, had all died on the same day, defeated by the arch enemies of Israel, the Philistines, a godless people who God would usually help them defeat. So then the leadership was without a king. The man who led the army under King Saul for all those 40 years was a man named Abner. So Abner had the power of the army at his disposal, and so he takes one of King Saul's remaining sons, who was named Ishbosheth, and he puts him on the throne. Ishbosheth probably wasn't the stellar man that he would hope to be king. And after a couple of years, Abner, who was the source of power in the kingdom at that time, is murdered. Not long after that, Ishbosheth is assassinated. So now you have this king, this nation, with no leadership, and it is chaotic. And it's described in 2 Samuel chapter 4 with this brief phrase, all Israel became alarmed. How many of you listened to the news yesterday and became alarmed? We have a time, I think, of dissolution and conflict and upheaval, maybe like they did. We get lots of media, we get lots of information, and it seems like our times are tumultuous as well, perhaps. Let's think back to your adult lifetime. Some of you are more adults than others because some of us have more gray hair than others, but most of us here have lived quite a while. And if we think back to what our earliest memories as childhood to what life seems like today, would you agree that there's been dramatic change? Sociologically, morally, technologically, educationally, you name it. Nothing is the same as it was in your memory long ago. But also, we have a situation now that I think is more distressing. We've always had different points of view, the Democrats and the Republicans and the Independents and all these things, and every group of people always has different opinions. That's fine. And there's always been various discussions and not always agreement. But one of the things that I've noticed in recent years that I do find distressing is that it seems now that it's become a more aggressive, deeply divided process. And related to that, particularly in recent years, I'm struck by the lack of civility between the parties. No one can seem to agree or disagree in a gracious way. Everything is conflicting and harsh and combative. And we're subjected to that all the time, and we wonder what will come of this? How will it turn out? And sadly, it kind of takes over our attention and distracts us from other things and causes unrest. So the need to understand the times is not just a need that these men in Issachar had thousands of years ago, it's a need that we have as well, because we live in a civilization ourselves. We all live somewhere, right? We all are where God has placed us. So we have to deal with our environment in some way. Now, we're in the environment of Oregon. I recently had an occasion to go to Tennessee. The environment in Tennessee is not the same. And those aren't nearly the same as if you went to, I don't know, North Korea. How would that be? So different environments have different impacts, but we all have to live and proceed in the place where we are. This is where we are today. So we'll spend a few minutes trying to get some insight from the Bible as to how can we discern our times and how can we know what to do. I confess that if I dwell a lot, if I spend too much time on my phone looking at the news or listening to the radio or whatever, I can get pretty distressed thinking about all the news and this person said this and that person said that. And I don't see things that I wish were there. I don't see respect for God. I don't see honor for Jesus Christ. I don't see many of the things that I think are important communicated there. And so I wish it could be different. I think, well, what could I do about that? Maybe you have similar thoughts. So we want to be like the men of Issachar. How can I know what to do in my time? Let's start by turning to Jeremiah 27. You probably don't read Jeremiah too often. I know I don't, but we'll have it on the screen here. The story is probably not too familiar to you, but we're going to look at it because it shows some fundamental concepts that are helpful to us as we think about this idea. First of all, what's the scene as we read this text? The scene is approximately 600 BC, long time ago. Well after King David for sure. By the time this scene is written, the Israelite people have lived in the land of Canaan, land of Palestine, promised by God for about 900 years. So they're well established. God brought them there, you recall, and He helped them clear out all the pagans who lived there because they'd been wicked people. And God made them a promise. If you'll be honest and faithful to me, I'll help you do well. I'll keep you safe. You'll be prosperous. You will honor me. We'll be an example to the whole world of how the relationship between God and men should work. It will be terrific. Now, most of us would take a deal like that. And the Israelites started to, but they had a 900-year cycle by the time we get to Jeremiah, whereby they've been faithful for a while, and then the good king dies, and somebody introduces the idea, well, let's have this idol as our God. And they'd go off that way. And God would say, no, that's not okay. They'd get some kind of a punishment event. They'd come back to God. They would be faithful for a while, and then they would go back to the idols, and it was a vicious cycle. Over time, the idol cycles got longer, the religious, faithful times got shorter, and finally, about 700 BC, 730, somewhere in there, the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes that lived in the land called Israel, were completely taken over by the Assyrians, and that nation, as an independent nation, just vanishes. They're not there anymore, because God says, that's what you get. Left the 2 tribes in the south, Judah it's called, where Jerusalem is. They're still hanging on. They were blessed with a good king named Josiah, and he brought back a good turning back to God, and there was a fairly good revival. But then, of course, Josiah dies, and his son takes on, and guess what happens? More idolatry. And now they're a much smaller group of religious people, and we get to Jeremiah 27. Early in the reign of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. This is what the Lord said to me, Jeremiah says. Now imagine the picture he's relating here. The Lord said, make a yoke out of straps and crossbars and put it on your neck. So he does that. Now you know what a yoke is? It's this big thing that you put on oxen, and they pull plows with it. So God tells him, make one of these for yourself, and he does. And then he goes out in public and he gives this message, standing there with this contraption on him. Then send word to the kings of Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon, through the envoys who have come to Jerusalem, to Zedekiah, king of Judah. Give them a message for their masters and say, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Tell this to your masters. With my great power and outstretched arm, I made the earth and its people and the animals that are in it, and I give it to anyone I please. Now I will give all your countries into the hands of my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now that's a pagan nation. I will make even the wild animals subject to him. All nations will serve him, and his son and his grandson, until the time for his land comes, and then many nations and great kings will subjugate him. God is laying out a plan. Verse 8, if, however, any nation or kingdom will not serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, or bow its neck under his yoke, I will punish that nation with the sword, famine, and plague, declares the Lord, until I destroy it by his hand. So do not listen to your prophets, your diviners, your interpreters of dreams, your mediums or sorcerers who tell you, you will not serve the king of Babylon. Official proclamations were going to be made in their nation saying this isn't really going to happen. God's saying they prophesy lies to you that will only serve to remove you far from your lands. I will banish you and you will perish. But if any nation will bow its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him, I will let that nation remain in its own land to till it and live there, declares the Lord. Wow. How about if you turn on the morning news tomorrow and that's what you hear? As you might expect, the people of Judah were already feeling a little bit tense. They were a fairly small nation. Assyria was enormous and very powerful. Babylon was enormous and very powerful, and they were pretty small. And they were worried about these things, particularly when their northern kingdom, their cousins, was taken over by Assyria. And then this message comes. So they are not happy to hear this. Came from the words of God through the lips of prophet Jeremiah. What was the response? The response is the whole chapter 28 of Jeremiah. We're not going to put it on the screen, but what it basically says is, after the prophet of God Jeremiah gave this message, then other prophets arose claiming to be speaking in the name of God, and they said, now, you know, this is not going to happen. We're going to beat Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to be fine. And that was the message they put out. Which message do you think was more popular? The message that says we're going to be okay. If you will, it was fake news. Because one of the things we learn when we go through the Old Testament is technology has changed over time. Science has changed, our understanding of it. What we know about all kinds of things in the world have changed. Our education has expanded. But human nature seems to remain the same. Human nature then was to say what people would rather hear, and it's the same today. But in the Jeremiah story, sure enough, God does just what He said He would do. And He comes, Nebuchadnezzar does, and he takes over things, and he takes a large group of the population, particularly the ruling class, and he moves them back to his home country of Babylon. And then we get to Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 4. That's our situation. This is what the Lord, the Almighty, the God of Israel says to those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. And here's why we're looking at this story today. It's a very unusual message. Things that people didn't want to happen have happened. Their nation is destroyed. They are now under the control of somebody else, and a large group of people have been carried to that new nation. And this message is to those people. People who were living in a place they didn't want to live, under the control of people who they didn't agree with and didn't like, dealing with politics and environment that they didn't approve of, and this is God's message to them. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the prosperity and peace of the city in which I carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for that city, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord of Almighty, the God of Israel says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreamers, to the dreams you are encouraged to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, said the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I've banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. The next sentence could be, but it's not going to be today. Amazing. At the same time that God's telling them, I know the great plans and future I plan for you, and what's going to happen, it's going to be positive. I'm going to come back and get you, you're going to be fine. He's saying it to the very people who He's telling, but meanwhile, you're going to be here pretty well your entire lifetime and most of the lifetimes of your children before any of that happens. Now, how many of us sometimes look at our life or the condition that we're in or the situation that we're undergoing, we think, I can't bear this. How could God be a part of this? How could this be anything but bad? I think those people probably thought that. And yet God's assuring them during that, I'm still in control. I have everything where it needs to be. This is going to be what you need to. My will is going to cover you, but you got to wait until I'm there. We have to deal with that in our own lives. So every time period that anyone's ever lived in, that was the case. God was involved. The primary fact I want us to get from this is, for the people of God, at a time that was very difficult, God was still in charge. When things seemed to be out of control and they were in a foreign land subjected to all kinds of influences they didn't want to have anything to do with, God was still in charge. And He's explaining to them some very specific things about His plan, because I'm convinced God always has plans. And they were specific. It will be a specific king, Nebuchadnezzar, in a specific country, Babylon, for a specific period of time, 70. That's not a vague concept, that's a plan. And it's more powerful to know that He's with them and instructing them what to do, even during this time of what seems to them to just be disaster. He's saying, go on with life. Do what you need to do in your daily life to live the way I would want you to live. That's what God wants us to do. Raise your families. Go to the synagogue. Tell your neighbors about God. Love your grandchildren. Do all these things that we do in daily life, even when things are perfect. We can do them when things are not perfect, to the extent we're able. And that, for us, is the will of God, the timeless message that He's sending us here. Now, God was allowing them to go through some difficult times. I can guess why. He was tired of idolatry. He was tired of the process. He was trying to convince them one more time to be holy. And sure enough, He did get enough of the remnant of faith to stay in place that God's plan goes forward from this same group of people, and we have Jesus Christ today. Unique way to do it. You and I might have used a different plan, but that was God's plan. And He still has plans for us in this day and age. God was very clear to them that this was a long-term process. And so they should not wape and wheel and moan and cry and woe is me, here I am a prisoner. They shouldn't be a victim. They should go on with their lives as well as they could in service to God in the way He would prefer wherever they were. They should not be dictated to by their environment. The point here, I think, is this. Those people found themselves in a situation where they could not control or determine where they would be. And we won't ask for a show of hands, but I'm pretty sure that every one of us at some time in life has been in a situation where we really were just stuck there. We really were just kind of forced to be there. And it wasn't necessarily where we wanted to be, but that's where we were. But God's telling these people here in this Jeremiah 29 that although you may not want to be at that place, you may not want to be where you are, while you're there, you can decide and you can be in charge of how you are, who you will be, what your behavior will be. And He's giving us the same message as well. Whatever our times, calm, tumultuous, good or bad, we can still decide what our response will be. So, how do we know what to do? It won't be the environment. It'll be how we should be relating to God. I also think an important part of this text is to remind us that God is continually active in human life. And I say that because many of the people that I deal with every day in my normal life, you couldn't tell by watching them if they even believe there is a God. I have to do this, I have to do that, I'm going to go here and this is going to happen and so and so. Is it possible that we sometimes fall into that situation as well? got to do this, my to-do list is that, and I got to be here on Thursday, and this is due by Friday, and blah, 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 blah. And pretty soon we've gone a long time and not even thought much about God. But that's not God's plan. We're to be God-centered people. God has an ongoing plan to redeem every person back to Himself. We in this room know that that redemption comes through Jesus Christ. And most of us here have committed ourselves to that. And so that is how we make our decisions. Now, while we're living wherever we are, we do have to deal with the government because we don't live in an anarchy. So we have to deal with that government in the best way. The New Testament has various texts about that. And it generally says that we're to honor the government and follow their rules. They rule by the power of God, etc. And the part about that I think is amazing is, who was the government at the time we read that in the New Testament? It was the Roman government. Did they worship God? Well, yeah, they worshiped Zeus and Apollyon and all these people. They had more gods than Carter has pills. Some of you never heard that phrase, but some of you have. But they didn't worship the God that we worship, and yet still the New Testament writers say, honor the government, they're there at the will of God, proceed with life. That's not what really matters to you. And we have to deal with that. So, how do we make practical decisions in that way? Well, let's look at how the men of Issachar did it. The men of Issachar got up every day, I'm assuming, as good Jewish men. I don't know this for sure. And they did what Jewish men did. They were a shepherd or a carpenter or whatever they did for a living. They had to care for their families and deal with their processes and earn a living and have breakfast and shoo the sheep out of the pen and do whatever their daily work was. And it was all in the context of being a practicing Jew. They read the law, they went to synagogue, they went and offered their sacrifices at the temple. They did all the things that Jewish people in their religious life did and earned a living as they went along. And then they lived in a nation that had a government. So the primary thing was their daily life and their service to God and how they would order things. The secondary thing for them was, how do I deal with the government? So when the government fails, they have to make a decision. We don't have a leader anymore. What are our choices to replace him? Well, we got King Saul's family, and we've seen 45 years or so of his history. So we could put one yet of his other sons on the throne. Or we got this David guy who kills giants as a kid, and he's a famous hero of the war, and we know he's already been chosen by God, and he seems to be a remarkable man, and he always is writing songs to God, and he's well known for doing good. And which one should we choose? And they compared it to their own value system, the things that they cared about. Was it a hard decision? No. They were able to use what was important to them in their lives to make applications to their government choices that they were allowed to make. I think that's how we do it. So, in an election year or any other time, we have to be focused on ourselves and God, and then to the extent that we have to deal with our environment, we make the choice as closely as we can that lines up with the God that we serve. I think that's how they knew what to do, and I think it's how we will know also. Now, when we're living wherever we are living, which happens now for us to be Oregon, we can also follow the advice that God gave to the people in Babylon. The people who didn't want to be there, but they were. Now, I confess, I'm in Oregon on purpose. I did a lot of things in my life to be able to come here and raise my family, and probably many of you are the same story. It's not a bad place. It's a good place. I don't always appreciate the government, but I appreciate getting to live here and be with you people. So how am I going to deal with that? I'm going to deal with it like the people in Issachar did. I'm going to relate as much as I can my behavior to the government in line with my value system that is based on what God tells me to do. And that's really all I can do. And I will feel good about that. Because we're not the first people to be in a situation where maybe our personal lives and our desire to serve God isn't the same point of view that our government has. Let's turn to 1 Peter 2, verse 9. This is a problem, it seems to me, that believers in Christ have always had. 1 Peter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possessions. That's us. We ought to just stop there and Praise God. That's who we are. That you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. That's our citizenship, right? We're citizens of God's kingdom. So that kind of settles it right off the bat. But we aren't living in God's physical presence yet. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have. And we praise God for that. Here's the main message. Dear friends, verse 11, I urge you as foreigners and exiles. Okay, now we just heard that we're chosen people, royal priesthood, a holy nation, and now he says we're foreigners and exiles. Well, that puts us in the same category as the Jewish people who were forced to go live in Babylon, right? Not their country, not their space, but that's where they have to be. So Peter is telling us that in the same way those guys were transplanted to a different place, once we have transferred our citizenship to God in heaven, we're going to be an alien, an exile, a temporary resident at wherever we are until we're living in the presence of God. And that would be us in this room today. So since you're foreigners and exiles, abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. You know what that means in real life? It means if your neighbor's mean to you, you shouldn't sneak over at night and kick over his garbage can. And any number of other things like that. We have to be on our best behavior, particularly when people are looking down their noses at us. Now, how popular are Christians today in America? Well, let's see. You got all these people in descending order, and then you get to the last one, which would be, axe murderers, and then you got 15 empty spots, and then you got Christians. Now that's a little bit exaggerated, I get it. But because we insist on certain things, that God's will is control, and Jesus is the source of my salvation, etc., that means that we are going to do what God asks us to do every chance we get. And that means that we may not think it's okay when these people over here are doing some really weird stuff. And if we mention that to them, then we are not enlightened. We are not well thought of. We are not intelligent. We're sort of, cavemen. And that's not popular. We are aliens in their culture since they don't honor God. We are going to be that way. So verse 13 says, we have then to deal with that and submit ourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. For it's God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Doesn't mean you rant and rave in their face. Doesn't mean we explain to them how dumb they are. Although we probably could do that. That'd be pretty pleasant. It means that we do it by the behavior of God. We do it by being so kind, so good, so moral, that even though they may despise us for doing it, they have to admit it's pretty good. That's what He's calling us to do. Live as free people, free in the realm of God, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Thank goodness we don't have an emperor. So, that's Peter's advice to us and how we should know what to do as we review the times. Now, we got specific evidences all through the Old Testament that God is still in charge, that God has interfered in personal lives. And I'm going to go over this just briefly because I want us to remember, as we are in times that may seem stressful to us, or we see something that really bothers us, or we have a negative experience in our own lives, we need to remember that we're not solo adrift in our boat all alone. God is with us, and we are living under the plan of God. As an evidence, centuries ago, God appears to a man named Abraham, and He says, Abraham, pick up everything you got, move to a place you've never heard of, and I'm going to make you a really big deal. And He does it. He makes this big, long trip, and he lives in a new land where he's an alien, and God says right off the bat, Abraham, you're going to have a huge family. The world's going to be blessed from you. All this land's going to be yours. And during his whole lifetime, for the next 25 years, Abraham doesn't have a son until he goes around God's plan and comes up with one a different way. And only when it's impossible for him to have a son anymore does he. God made him wait 25 years. It's a long wait. Two decades later, or 2 generations later, Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph. God says, I'm going to use Joseph. I'm going to take him down to Egypt, and I'm going to give him several years there to learn the language, and to learn the people, and to learn how the economy works, and to learn how the whole process is involved. I'm going to get him acclimated to Egypt, and I'm going to give him power, and I'm going to keep him safe that whole time. And then when it's the right time, I'm going to put him in charge, because I got to save the family of Abraham from a terrible famine, because if they all die, we'll never get to Jesus. That was God's plan. Great plan. You know what the problem was from Joseph's point of view? God didn't send him the memo. All Joseph knew was his brothers hated his guts. They sold him as a slave. He goes hundreds of miles away and lives as a slave in a man's house with no hope of escape. He works his way back to the top. An evil woman gets him in trouble again, and now he's in prison for several years. So 10 years, maybe 15 go by, and this young man, all he knows is, I'm stuck here. Why would God do this to me? And I have to decide what I'm going to do. You know what he decided? He would be faithful to God. And sure enough, how long is 15 years when you're like 18? Oh my stars, it's the end of time. He waited. Where's God? And all at once there he was, because God had been there every day. God was with him. And he knew that internally, but he didn't know all the details. Now, does that apply to your life? Has God made us wait? Has He put us in situations where we got to plow through stuff? And man, it seems like a long time. But I would wager that every one of us, if we were honest and we were thoughtful, we could look back at times in our lives where things were difficult and we finally came through it, and we could see God's hand had been in it. Because that's the way God works. He is always going to be there. For evidence of that, let's turn to John 14:23. Because as we are trying to understand the times, some of them will be difficult. Jesus replied, anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. Now, how many of you have ever gone to somebody's house and spent the night? Raise your hand. Some of you don't get out much. You go to somebody's house and you spend 3 nights. Do you have an effect on that household when you're there? Can you go and be in somebody else's house for 3 days and not have an effect? No. Things change when you're there. So if you're going to believe in Jesus and in God and give yourself to Him as we have done, He says, God and I are both going to come and live with you. You can't live with somebody and not affect their lives. That's the good news for us. The last thing Jesus said as He was leaving the earth, remember? My mental picture, He's now up in the sky about 15 feet looking down at these people He loves. I don't know how it looked really, but that's my mind picture. His last words are, be sure of this, I'm with you always to the very end of the age. So God's here. He is part of our lives. He is in control at the national level and at the individual level. And that's what we can know as we're trying to understand the times and know what we should do. So, where do we live? What is our environment like? Well, it's a difficult environment today. One of the things that I would say, if you ask me to describe our environment today, our times today is, what are the people like in your country? And I would have to say, if I could choose one word for the whole nation, I would say self-centered. And I'm not, of course. And I know that most of you aren't. If If you don't believe it, just watch how somebody acts in the fast food line where they're going to spend $6 right in front of you. They want it exactly how they want it right now, and if it's wrong, boy, somebody's going to hear about it. And that's just for cheap lunch. So, we have lived in an environment now where God isn't much of a concern to people. What I want right now is a concern to me. And that makes it hard. Our grandparents lived in a totally different time. Our grandparents lived in a time when my grandfather was born early on, before the Depression even came. They were desperately poor. I guarantee the house they lived in wouldn't have passed code. He said when he woke up in the mornings many times as a teen, he lived in the attic of this little cheap house they had. There would be snow on his blanket where it had sifted through the shingles. He went down, it was his job to build a fire that morning in the only stove they had. And he said, I would sit there by the stove and I could look down through the floorboards and I could see the chickens underneath. Now that's poor. But he was like tens of millions of Americans in those days. And then came the Depression, where he said during the Depression he'd been able to get a job working for the railroad. He said, I worked 12 hours a day, Monday through Saturday, for $1 a day, driving railroad spikes. Missouri Pacific built a spur through where he lived. And that kept us alive for about 3 months. And he had to walk to work every day because he didn't have a car or a horse. Now that's desperately poor. By the time he came to the end of his life, he lived in a house that was a very nice house, had multiple cars, had all kinds of toys, and when he needed heat then, he didn't have to look through the floorboards and see the chickens and put fire in the stove. He just went over and flicked the central thing, and it just came on. That's a lot of change in one lifetime, right? We've gone through all that, and we understand that. So the times always change. But just very quickly, as we consider the times we've lived in, let's look at this quick chart. Who remembers when you were a little small child, everybody went to church, did a certain thing, and things were pretty calm, and then all at once, we began to have flower power? Remember flower power? Do you remember free love, man? Groovy, man. Who's ever seen a bumper sticker that says, if it feels good, do it? Was that shocking? How about Woodstock? Let's all be anarchists for a few days. 1963, the Supreme Court decision to remove prayer and religion from schools. Don't want to enforce anything on anybody. It might be infringement of their rights. Now, I wish we had 6 lessons to talk about what that one thing has done as you go 50 or 60 years later where we are now. When I was a kid in high school, I was a country boy. You would have never known that. There was at least 20 guns on my campus every day. We'd go out and look at them at lunch if we needed to. No one ever considered using one today, and yet now people are shot in their schools. Could that be related to the decision in 1963? I think so. Because at the same things are happening in the world, God is in charge, but who else gets to have free reign? Satan. And he never sleeps. So we see in our times that Satan is always active. 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. That was a very positive intent to make things better, to make everything equal. No discrimination for race, creed, color, sex, religion, or orientation. Very positive thing. But if you look at all the things that's done since then, it's positive. But yet many of the things that we have in society today come from that same legislation because it's not illegal to do this, and some people get way out there. Satan is always active. 1969, you remember in the middle of the night watching the astronauts walk on the moon? Remarkable. 1973, the Supreme Court legalized Roe versus Wade. You can abort your child if you don't want him. The National Right to Life Association calculates, based on national records that are available, approximately 61,600,000 humans have been killed before they were ever born under this law. Now, I don't hear any concept or discussion in the public news media about what impact would 61 million people, if they were alive today, in the workforce have. What would our economy be? What would have been created? Would one of those people have been able to cure Alzheimer's or cancer or I don't know what, but that's a loss. Satan has been involved in our society. And lastly, how many of you have a smartphone? I meant to bring mine. If you have a smartphone, raise your hand. Holy cow. And if you don't have a smartphone, or if you do, how many have a computer at home? Amazing. Did you know that when you pull your smartphone out of your pocket, you have it because in 1947 some guys invented a weird little thing called a transistor. Who remembers the first transistor radio they ever saw? Mine came from China, cost $9, would not work. But now, you pull out that phone, you have access to more computing power than we used to get men on the moon. You have access through that to the most amazing source of data and technology ever even conceived of in the internet. And whatever tremendously helpful thing you can think of, you can probably find somebody writing about it on the internet. And whatever intensely, overtly, disgustingly evil that you want to see pictures of, you can find it on that same phone. Satan is there. So, this 80 years of technological marvelousness has changed our times dramatically, just like all these other things have, and yet we still have to deal with our times based on what? God and what He wants us to do. Satan's real. We have to beware, and that's why we turn to 1 Peter 5:8. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. So when you pull out your cell phone and you're tempted to look at something or waste an hour that you shouldn't waste, just know that everybody who's a believer and has a smartphone has the same temptation. So call somebody and say, talk me out of this if you need to. We have to have strategies. We have to make our decisions, having understood our times, based on what God wants us to do. And He will help us. So, as we begin the year 2020, I think our goal ought to be to follow Jesus every day as well as we can, because that'll put us in the same place that God's original plan was, which means I get to see the face of God every day for eternity. But I have to act today. I have to understand my times. I have to know that I'm an alien in this society because I'm in God's society. And as much as we can, we need to be obedient servants of both God's society and the society where we live, but God will always need to win. Thank you for listening so well. Thank you for coming out on this morning and worshiping God. Hope you have a tremendously blessed day, and that you'll take the time to share your kindness with somebody else on the way out. Thank you very much.